This is your Bible Geeks Daily Download into the book 2 Corinthians chapters 2 through 6.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning began maybe her most famous sonnet ever with these words, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." And as Paul attempts to reconnect with the Corinthian church after his challenging first letter and painful visit to them, he begins counting the ways he loves them with some poetic language of his own. He says in 2 Corinthians 2 verse 4, "For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you."
And so first he talks about the aroma. On Monday in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, after urging them to forgive their penitent brother, Paul compares himself to a captive of Christ in a triumph. He likens his work of spreading the knowledge of Christ to a permeating fragrance in the world. Why do you think their discipline was so effective toward this sinning brother? And what do they need to do now?
And how far and wide does the aroma of your teaching spread around you? Second, he talks about the letter. On Tuesday in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul defends himself against those who questioned his credentials as an apostle of Christ. But Paul shows them his credentials by pointing them to a mirror. "You yourselves are our letter of recommendation," he says in 2 Corinthians 3:2, "written on our hearts to be known and read by all." So where does Paul's confidence come from?
And how does the glory of the old covenant differ from the glory of the new covenant? And third, he talks about the clay pot. On Wednesday in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul contrasts his human frailty with the light of Christ's glory that shines in him. He calls his body a jar of clay, but he keeps suffering and speaking because believers must speak, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. And so what'll happen if we blindly ignore the light of Christ?
And what's the difference between what the outer person is going through and what the inner one experiences? Fourth, Paul talks about the tent. On Thursday in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul takes his weakness a step further, comparing the tent we live in now with the eternal building God prepares for the faithful. But while we're here, we aim to please him, persuade others, and live as a new creation. So are you comfortable in this tent or groaning for something more?
What motivates you to be Christ's ambassador in this world? And finally, he talks about the temple. On Friday in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul says that now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 2. It's time to cast away unhealthy friendships with the world and embrace a relationship with God as his temple. So are you surprised by anything Paul uses to commend himself?
And how can you cut ties with darkness today?
So let's fall in love with Paul's words as we read 2 Corinthians chapters 2 through 6 this week, and may the Lord bless you and keep you today.
Shalom.